Welcome back. This week we are moving on to talk about another type of important hazard event, which is flooding. So our goals for this lesson are first to appreciate the variability of our natural world, then to understand how floods are measured, to calculate the flood risk to particular locations, and then to look at some of the measures that we might take for managing floods, to avoiding having a flood hazard turn into a flood disaster. So before we get to talking about floods specifically, I want to talk in more general terms about the variability of our natural world. So the natural world varies a lot. It changes over time. So our land, our water, our ecosystems, and so forth don't stay the same over a variety of time scales, over hour by hour time scales, day to day, year to year, decade to decade. They're always changing, and they're changing in unpredictable kinds of ways. And so as an example there's some rainfall data for the town of Bungaree in Australia, and you can see that they go back and forth sometimes from one year just to the next between droughts and floods, just giant ups and downs in the amount of rainfall that they're getting there. And pre-industrial societies adapted to these changes in their environment. They structured their way of life to go along with these cycles and these changes in the natural world. They had ways of altering their way of life based on whether it was, a drought year or a flood year, based on whether it was a warm year or a cold year, and all the other types of variability that exist in our environment. But when we move into industrial society, so that's only within the last 200 years or so, we can no longer really handle that vulnerability so easily. Our industrial processes need our environment to be stable and predictable so that we can keep running at maximum efficiency. And so this natural variability that societies in the past would have been able to roll with comparatively easier, our current society has become very fragile, has become a society that takes a lot of damage when our natural world goes through these cycles and changes. And yet at the same time, our industrial society is causing our natural world to become more unstable, more unpredictable, more variable. And we're going to be looking at one of the major ways that we do that through climate change a little later in our class. But I just want to kind of point out that irony here that modern industrialized societies have less ability to cope with variability in nature and yet are causing nature to become even more unstable and unpredictable than it's been in the past. So one of the major forms of variability in our natural environment is the amount of water that is around, the amount of precipitation we get, and then the amount of water that we have in streams and water bodies that collect that precipitation. So the water levels in our streams, so water courses of all different sizes, is variable. It goes up and down both seasonally and over the course of years. So you'll have some years where the streams are running high, some years when they're running low. And many ecosystems and cultures depend on this variability. They actually would suffer if the stream was running at exactly the same level all the time. You need sometimes for the water to rise up out of the banks of the stream and flood the area around it, and sometimes for it to fall down really low. So ecosystems and many cultures adapt to and need that variability. But modern industrial societies will try to even out those stream levels, make it very predictable so we know exactly how much water is going to be coming down the river at any one point. And a good illustration of this is the Aswan High Dam on the Nile River in southern Egypt. So the Nile River, if you remember learning about ancient Egypt in your classes, the Nile River is very variable from year to year and over the course of the year. It has a flood season and a drought season. And that was actually essential to the way of life of people in Egypt for thousands upon thousands of years. Because when the river floods, that adds moisture to the land that it's flooding, and it adds new soil. So sediment that's coming down the river is deposited on the land, so it replenishes the soil. So farming in Egypt, remember, you're along this river in the middle of a desert. So farming in Egypt was very dependent on having a flood from the river every year to moisten the soil, replenish the soil with new sediment, and to make that land more fertile. But this flooding was a disruption to life. People had to move out of areas that were being flooded. Homes couldn't be built in ways that would get ruined by the flood. So you can build big, fancy, permanent kinds of houses in areas that were going to get flooded. And people didn't like that. So in the 60s, they built this dam in southern Egypt. And the idea was the dam would hold back the floodwaters during the flood season and then let them out during the dry season, and thereby even out the water level downstream of the dam. So the river would be at the same level year round. That would make it easier for ships to come and go on the river because the water level would always be the same. Could make it easy to build things around the river because you always know exactly how high the river was going to be, so you didn't have to worry about building something in a place that would get flooded, etc. The downside to this was now all of the fields in Egypt were no longer being replenished by this annual flood cycle. And so farmers in Egypt had to turn to artificial fertilizers and artificial pesticides to control pests, insects, and so forth that would have been washed away by the floods. Now they can hang out year round and hurt the crops. So they were putting all these additional chemicals onto their fields to compensate for the loss of this flood cycle. And so that was expensive for these farmers. It also led to a lot of pollution because these agricultural chemicals would wash off into the Nile River. And we now have a dead zone in the Mediterranean Sea near the mouth of the Nile River that's caused by these agricultural chemicals, which farmers in Egypt are using because the river no longer floods because they built this dam to even out the water flow over the course of the year. So before we talk about floods, I want to say a little bit about drought, the flip side to floods. Floods, we have too much water. Drought, we have not enough water. And when we talk about drought, drought can actually mean three different things. There's three different levels of drought that we might have. So we can first talk about a meteorological drought. So meteorology is the study of weather. So a meteorological drought means reduced precipitation. It hasn't been raining or snowing as much as usual. Then we have a hydrological drought. So hydrology is the study of water. Hydrological drought is a reduced water storage in reservoirs or aquifers. So when that precipitation falls, runs off the land, it ends up in rivers, it ends up filtering into aquifers underground, it ends up captured in lakes and reservoirs, etc. And that's where we would get that water from to do things like drink or take a shower or water crops or so forth. And so if a meteorological drought goes on long enough, it turns into a hydrological drought. We start to run out of having enough water stored in these places where we draw that water from. And then we have the socioeconomic drought. So that is when the drought begins to impair human activities. So people start to actually be negatively impacted by that drought. So we can have a hydrological drought. We can have low levels of water in our reservoirs, but there's still enough for people to keep living their lives as normally. So we're not yet in a socioeconomic drought. Once it starts to actually affect how people live, then we're in that socioeconomic drought. So you can see there the ideas that we were talking about last time about the way a disaster is the result of a combination of the hazard event, which would be the reduced precipitation, reduced water availability, and then human vulnerability. Are we doing things that need more water than turns out to be available? And so some of those impacts that a drought might have on human activities include, first, lack of water for daily use, drinking, cleaning, bathing, etc. Then we can have crop failure. If we're using that water to irrigate crops that we depend on for our food, depend on for money if we're selling those crops, and we can't irrigate them well enough, and then we get crop failures. Water is also important for industrial uses. Lots of different manufacturing processes use sometimes very large amounts of water. And so if we don't have enough water, then those industrial uses are impaired or even have to shut down. We also get intensification of pollution. So there's a lot of pollution that goes into our waterways. And if you've got a lot of water, then that pollution gets diffused. Right? It gets mixed in with a large amount of water, so it's not very concentrated, it's not as dangerous, and it gets kind of washed away downstream by that water. If you've got a lot less water, then that pollution is going to be a lot more concentrated in the water that you have. So you get an intensification of whatever kinds of water pollution you might have in that area. And you can also get degradation of soil. So if soil is excessively dry for long periods of time, it can actually damage the soil, the structure of the soil, the nutrients in the soil. You can even have like sinkholes forming if you have aquifers that have lost water and so the ground collapses downward. All these things that damage the soil. So even if you come out of the drought and you get water flowing to the area again, that soil may have lost its quality, lost its ability to grow crops or whatever you were doing with that soil if the drought had gone long enough to damage the soil. So those are some of the kinds of impacts that a drought, a lack of enough water, can have. We then flip over to floods. One of the first things that we should note is that droughts are usually slow onset hazards. You don't just wake up in the morning and suddenly there's a drought. It's a long-term, slow process that just creeps up on you. So you can see it coming from a long way away, but because it happens slowly, it sometimes takes a while for people to really kick into gear and realize that this is a serious problem that we need to do something about. Floods, on the other hand, tend to be rapid onset hazards. Floods tend to happen very quickly when they do happen. So some of the harms that a flood can do to you, and we actually saw some of these illustrated not too far from Slippery Rock a few years ago when we had some major floods in the town of Harmony, just down the road from Slippery Rock. Some of the hazards that you can run into are drowning. The most obvious thing is if you get caught in those floodwaters, you could drown. You also have people and property being swept away by the flowing waters. So when floodwaters come in, they're often moving very fast. They've got a lot of energy, a lot of force behind them. And so they can grab you and drag you away. They can move cars. They can move houses. There have been houses, and luckily there in Harmony, you can see the houses are still nicely lined up on the street. This flood didn't come in quite that hard, at least at this area, but there are plenty of incidences in which floodwaters are coming so hard that they actually lift houses off their foundations and move them downstream. They can uproot trees and all kinds of other things. Can just get moved away by the force of the water coming in the flood. You also have pollution in floodwater. So those floodwaters are full of all kinds of stuff. There is anything that flood has washed across, it's going to pick up and it's going to be in that water. And so there's a lot of danger if there are chemicals that have gotten mixed into that water. So if it has, for example, flooded through a gas station, various chemicals, gasoline and stuff could have gotten into that water. If it flowed through industrial areas where various chemicals are being used, it'd pick up that. If it flowed across agricultural land, it might have picked up agricultural chemicals, fertilizers and pesticides, and so forth. If it flooded through houses, you've got all kinds of chemicals in your house that you wouldn't want to pour into your bathtub and get in there with. You've also got the potential for disease-causing agents to be in there as well. If the flood has disrupted, say, sewage systems, then all the stuff that's in your sewage that you don't want to be in contact with is going to be in those floodwaters. So it's a really bad idea to go into, like, wade through a flooded area if you can avoid it. Obviously, if you're escaping from floodwaters, you may have to do that. But if you can avoid it, don't go wading in floodwater because there's a lot of nasty stuff that might be in there, might be very hazardous to you, and it can be very hazardous if it gets left behind as the floodwaters recede. They'll just leave that stuff laying in your house, in your lawn, in the road, and everything else. Then being underwater can damage structures and other property. So all of those houses that you see there, if those houses are built out of wood and they've got carpet and stuff in them, and that gets soaked by this water, then once the floodwaters recede, all of that material in the house that's been soaked full of water is now going to start decaying. It's going to get mold and rot. The structural integrity of it is going to be damaged. So when a house gets flooded, you often have to kind of gut it and redo floors and walls and so forth that got soaked by that water because it can do some pretty serious damage to those structures. And we also get flooding accelerating erosion and deposition. And this is something we're going to talk about a bunch more next week, the processes of erosion and deposition. But floods, because they bring a lot of force with them, they can erode a lot of soil and rocks and other materials from one place and then leave it somewhere else and alter the course of our waterways by doing that. So how do we measure a flood? Well, there's a few different variables that we might look at to describe the size of a flood that we're getting. So one way that we can talk about the size of a flood is called the discharge. So this is the rate at which water moves past a certain point in the channel. So we pick a spot where we're going to measure the flooding, and we're saying how much water is moving past that spot. And we usually measure it in something like cubic feet per second or cubic meters per second. So what's the volume of water moving past this spot in the river every second? And so discharge tells us like literally the amount of water that we're getting. But this is a very hard thing to accurately measure because the shape of our stream channels is so irregular. It changes depending on how high up the banks you're getting. So most places, it's very difficult to be gathering the kind of data that you'd need to accurately measure discharge. So instead, what we often rely on in practice when we're looking at floods is what we call the flood stage. So the stage is the height of the surface of the water above a reference point that we consider normal. So we have kind of an average height that this waterway is. So the normal height of this water, and then we measure how high in feet or in meters above that normal level the surface of the water has gotten. And so we can measure that pretty easily. All we need is some sort of measuring stick, and we have those installed lots of places wherever we might put something vertical in a stream bed. So in the picture there, you see on the side of that bridge there, we've just got painted on the side of the bridge the heights above that normal level. So you're driving across that bridge and you see what number the water is at. That tells you the stage of the flood at that point in time. So it's way easier to measure than discharge. The catch is that the stage doesn't have a linear or predictable relationship with discharge. So, the higher the discharge, the higher the stage, and vice versa, because more water means the surface is going to get higher up. But because the banks of streams tend to slope outwards, each additional meter or foot of height to the water you get is going to require even more total volume of water in the stream than the last one, but it's going to require a different amount more because those sides change, they get steeper and shallower as they go. And so you'd have to have really accurate modeling of the exact shape of the channel there to calculate discharge based on stage. So they both go in the same direction, they both in the same order, but there's not a direct relationship. Knowing one doesn't necessarily let you calculate the other exactly. And then when we're looking at a flood event, so we're looking at the flood of 92 or whatever, we often talk about it in terms of its peak. So the peak of a flood is the highest stage that it reached during that flood event. So generally you'd have the rain starts to fall, the water starts to rise, it rises and rises. Eventually, it hits the highest point that it's going to get to, and then it falls back down towards normal. So the peak is that highest stage that flood reached. And so when we're talking about flood events and looking at multiple floods that have happened in the past, we often talk about them each in terms of just what is their peak, what's the highest that the water got during that flood event. So you may have heard the term like a 100-year flood or a 500-year flood or something like that get brought out when there's a really big flood and you're trying to describe the magnitude of this flood. And this is a somewhat misleading terminology. It's terminology that is so prevalent that I want to talk about it and make sure that you understand what people mean when they say it, but it's also not a great term because it can be misleading. What we mean when we say a 100-year flood is a flood that has a 1 in 100 chance or a 1% chance of occurring in a given year. So a flood that high or higher has a 1 in 100 or 1% chance of happening that year. That's what we mean by a 100-year flood. Using that description, 100-year flood tends to imply that floods are on some sort of a schedule, right? And that, oh, we had a 100-year flood last year, so that means we won't have another one for a while. Or we haven't had a 100-year flood in over 100 years, so that means we're due. Neither of those things is true. How high your flood is this year has no relationship with how high it might be next year. There's not like a regular schedule. You're never due for a flood of a certain size, or you can't assume that because you had a big flood that you now have some breathing room and aren't going to get a big one. All a 100-year flood means is that a flood of this height or greater would be expected to have a 1 in 100 chance of happening that year. And so we can turn a return interval, so a 100-year flood, that's a return interval description, like how often you expect that flood to return on average. We can convert that into an exceedance probability. That's the chance that we would have a flood of that size. And I think an exceedance probability is a better way to think about it, but return interval is the way we often hear people talk about it. So if you have a return interval of 2 years, so you have a 2-year flood, that has an exceedance probability of 50%. So if a 2-foot high flood is a 2-year flood, that means it's got a 1 in 2 chance of happening each year. 1 in 2 chance, that converts to 50% probability. A 5-year flood would be a flood that peak has a 1 in 5 chance of happening each year, and you can convert that fraction. That's a 20% chance of happening each year. And then we go all up the way up to 100-year flood means 1 in 100 chance of happening in a given year. That's a 1% chance. A 200-year flood has a 0.5% chance of happening, and a 500-year flood means it has a 0.2% chance of happening. So we're just converting the fractions there, right? So you put 1 over the return interval, 1 over the year number of flood, and turn that into a percentage, and that gives you your exceedance probability, the percentage chance that you would have a flood at least that high or higher in a given year. And this is all calculated from a database of past flood levels. So if we've been gathering data at a certain location for a long time, and we know what the peak flood was each year, the highest flood that happened during that year, we can use that to calculate the return interval and the exceedance probability for that size of a flood at that location. So here's how we do that. And so yes, this is a bit of math, but it's fairly straightforward math, I think, that you can implement in a program like Excel really easily. So if you want to calculate the return interval for floods of different heights at a particular location, and you've got some data from that location, you have the peak flood for each year over some period of years at that location. So first, you're going to try to get as many years of data as you can. The more years of data you have, the more accurate your calculations are going to be. For this little toy example, I've got just 10 years of data, or actually 11 years of data here from 1989 to 1999 for a particular location in Oregon, just because that's what I had handy. But usually you'd have more data than this, and the more you have, the better your calculations. Next thing you're going to do is you're going to rank those floods. So you're going to give a 1 to the highest flood. So in this case, within this set of data, our highest flood was the one that had a discharge of 40,500 cubic feet per second. You'll notice this data, we've actually got discharge data, but you can do the same thing if what you've got is the flood stage, the height of the water. Same thing happens because the floods will be in the same rank order. And that's what you're doing, is you're ranking the order of them. So your top flood, your highest flood year was 1999, so that gets a 1. Our second highest flood in the record was 34,000 cubic feet per second in 1996, so that gets a 2, et cetera, on down to, we're giving an 11. The 11th ranked year was 1992, when the highest flood was only 10,800 cubic feet per second. So we rank each of those years. Then we're going to apply the formula Ri equals n plus 1 over m to each year. And so what that means, Ri is our return interval. That's what we're trying to calculate. Then N is the number of years of data that we have. So in this case, we had 11 years of data. So we're going to take 11 plus 1 as our numerator. So the number of years of data you're dealing with plus 1. Then you divide it by the rank for each year. So we're doing this formula once for each year. So we're going to take, in this case, 12 divided by the rank for each year. Since we have 11 years of data, 12 divided by the rank for each year to find out each year's return interval. So 12 over 1 gives us a 12-year flood. That's our 12-year return interval. Then we have 12 over 2 for 1996, right? 12 divided by that year's rank, that gives us 6. So it's a 6-year flood in 1996, etc., down the chart there. And then once we have those return intervals, we can convert them into exceedance probabilities. We just convert that 1 over the return interval, turn that into a percentage. That's our return interval. Now, we only had these 11 years of data here. So we can only directly calculate the height of a 12-year flood because we've only got 11 years to work with. However, because these floods tend to follow predictable patterns, we can use a trend line to calculate the likely return interval or the size of floods with longer return intervals based on this data. So we can graph these. If we graph these, the discharge amount, so the size of the flood versus its return interval, we get a chart like this, and we would calculate the trend line through that, and we could use that trend line to extrapolate the size of floods of larger return intervals. And you're going to be doing this in your exercise for this week, and I will have another video going through in a little more detail exactly how you do those calculations, how you put it all in Excel. So I just want to, in the lecture part, just give you the conceptual idea of how this works, that we can create that trend line and extrapolate out what our return intervals would be for bigger floods. So now I want to talk a bit about how we get that flood happening. Where does all this water come from? Well, this water for a flood typically is coming from runoff from precipitation. Obviously, you can have a flood if like a dam breaks and then that releases a whole bunch of water. That's a flood and it's not necessarily related to precipitation. But most of the time when we have a flood, it's because we've gotten a lot of rain or snow. And that rain or snow has run off into our streams, raised the water level in them to a flood height. So the amount of water that's flowing in our streams is going to be a function of three main things that are going to affect how much water is going into our streams. So the first is the intensity of the rainfall. Are you getting, just a little bit of dripping precipitation coming down, or are you getting lots of hard rain, lots of water falling in a period of time? So how much rain is falling, the intensity of it. Then the drainage area. So how much area's water is draining down to a particular point where you're concerned about it flooding. So you can think of that as essentially how much land is getting rained on that's upstream of the point that we're worried about flooding. If you've got a lot of land upstream whose water is going to run down to the point that might flood, then you're going to have a bigger flood than if you don't have very much upstream land to feed runoff down to your point of interest. And then the third thing is what's called the runoff coefficient, because when rain falls on the ground, not all of it is going to run off into a stream. Some of it is going to get absorbed by the ground, and it's going to either stay there and then maybe eventually evaporate once it stops raining, or it's going to move very slowly through the soil into aquifers and maybe eventually join that stream, but not immediately. So that runoff coefficient, that's how much of that rainfall is actually running off versus getting absorbed into the ground before it reaches your stream. That runoff coefficient is highly variable. There's a lot of factors that can shape the runoff coefficient. That includes the slope of the land. The steeper the land, the quicker things are going to run off of it. The surface cover. So is this a, concrete paved surface? Is it a rocky surface? Is it grass? Is it a forest? Various other things that might be on your surface are going to affect how well that water can get absorbed into the ground. The soil type. So what kind of soil do you have under there? Is it clay soil? Is it sandy soil, etc.? And then the presence of drainage infrastructure. So that's why I've got a picture of that drain there. So in that little local area around that drain in that picture, you can see there's a bit of paved area that's like a parking lot there that all the water that falls on that pavement is going to run right off of it. And you can see they've made a little channel to send it right down to that drain to get rid of it because that water's got nowhere else to go. On the other hand, you've got that grassy area around the drain, and that's going to soak up a lot of water. So most of the runoff flowing into that drain is going to be what's coming off the paved area there, because unless you're getting really hard rain, the soil and the grass around the other sides of that drain are going to soak up a lot of it, and there's not going to be as much running off into the drain. So that grassy area is going to have a lower runoff coefficient than the pavement. And this is actually a major way that the way that people use the land shapes our vulnerability to floods, because typically stuff that people build has a higher runoff coefficient than natural stuff. So if you think of an area becoming urbanized, right, getting converted from forests and farmlands and stuff into cities and shopping plazas and houses and stuff, as we urbanize the land, we're building a lot of stuff with a high runoff coefficient, a lot of stuff that doesn't absorb any of the precipitation that falls on it. You've got the roofs of buildings. Those don't absorb rainfall, they just shunt it off to the side and send it on towards your drainage channels. We've got roads and parking lots that are paved. And those, again, they don't absorb that water, they just channel it off towards your streams. So that means if you get rain falling, and so in this diagram, the blue bars there are indicating the amounts of rain that are falling on our place, right? So we've got several hours of rainfall happening. If that rainfall is falling on a largely non-urbanized area, you see that it's going to start running off into our streams. And it's going to take a while for it to get through to our streams. So the peak of those streams, the peak flood that those streams are going to have as a result of this rainfall is going to happen sometime after the peak of the rain. It's going to take a while for that water to get down to the streams and fill it up. And then that peak is slowly going to recede over time. When we have urbanized the area, as I should say, that's the dotted line there, that's the non-urbanized land curve. When we urbanize that area, when we build lots of paved things and hard roofs on our buildings and so forth, we shift that curve. So the peak happens sooner because stuff is running off right into the streams. It's not getting absorbed into the soil and vegetation and slowly making its way to the stream. It's just shooting right out there through our sewer systems and our drainage channels and so forth. So the peak is happening sooner. The peak is also higher. So we get lots of water going into the stream right away, and then that peak falls back down very quickly. So our peak happens sooner and it's bigger when we have more urbanized land, when we have more stuff paved and built over. And so the height of our floods that we get in urbanized areas tends to be bigger than we would have gotten in those areas with the same rainfall if they hadn't been built up into an urbanized area. And it's a big challenge for engineers these days, is to find ways to deal with water runoff that isn't just shunting it directly into waterways where it's going to create higher floods, finding ways to let pavement absorb more of that water, for example. So that's a big ongoing environmental challenge for engineers, is how to bring that urbanized flood curve back down, even out that peak, because the higher that peak is, the more damage that flood could be doing to people. Since, of course, an urbanized area, there's lots of people, lots of stuff people care about there that has the potential to get damaged by those floods. So now I want to look at some of the ways that we could manage floods. If we have an area that we've got people living in it and that it's susceptible to floods, what might we do to try to keep the flood hazard from turning into a flood disaster? One thing we could do is we can build levees. So this is basically just a wall that's going to block those floodwaters. So build a wall or an embankment along where our water bodies are so that they can't flow over into the places that we're living or farming or whatever else. So if this works, that's great. It keeps the water in the channel, keeps it from flooding any of the stuff that we're concerned about. But there are a lot of potential drawbacks to building levees. So one is that it's catastrophic if it's breached or overtopped. So if our flood rises even higher than the levee, and the levee is a finite height because we can only afford to build it a certain height. If our flood gets bigger than that and it flows over the levee, then all those people, and you can see in that photo that there's that street there with some driveways off of it. It's actually lower down than where those floodwaters are on the other side of the levee. If those floodwaters overtop that levee, those people are in big trouble. You get a lot of water rushing down at them. And if something were to breach that levee, if there were a weakness in it that were to collapse under the pressure from that water on the other side, you get a huge amount of water shooting through at that breach point. That's, again, potentially really catastrophic for the people on the other side of the levee. Levees also can funnel the floodwaters towards vulnerable areas. So imagine that you've got a stream that might flood, and you've got a rich neighborhood on one side of the stream and a poor neighborhood on the other side. Rich neighborhoods are going to be able to afford to build a bigger and better levee, and so they might build it there on their side to protect themselves from the flood. Well, what they've just done now is pushed all the floodwater over towards the poor town that couldn't afford to build a big or effective levee. So all that floodwater is now going just to one side, and so the flooding is actually getting worse on the other side, the people who are poor and have less ability to cope with getting flooded. So we see that often happening where some areas will build levees and it will push the flood into other areas that couldn't build corresponding levees. And the more levees you build, the more floodwater is getting pushed towards whoever doesn't have a levee. And then it can also encourage development in dangerous areas. So in that picture, you see those people are living below the level of where that floodwater is. And so that levee can give you a false sense of security. And you're like, oh, the levee will hold back the floodwater, so we can build all kinds of stuff and not have to worry about flooding down here. And then once the levee fails, which it eventually might happen, then you're in big trouble. Another thing we can do about floods is flood-resistant architecture. We can build our homes and other structures in ways that aren't going to get as damaged if there is a flood. So one thing you might do is you might put your house up on stilts. So that house there in the picture, that can withstand a flood that might rise, 6 feet above ground level, much less above wherever the actual level of the water in the area is, because it's up on those stilts. So that's great. Downside is, first, it's expensive to do that. It's costly to do that for new construction, and it may be just flat out impossible to retrofit an existing building. So if that house was built on the ground, there might be no practical way to lift it up onto stilts, depending on how it was built and so forth. It just might be impossible. You'd have to totally knock down the house and build a brand new one if you wanted to implement some of these things. And there are big trade-offs. So that house has no basement, and basements are important. They're very useful things to have when it's not flooding. And so that house has made the trade-off to not have a basement in order to be able to be up on stilts and survive the flood. So those are trade-offs that you'd have to make with flood-resistant architecture. Another thing we might do is to protect or expand wetlands. So these might be natural wetlands that existed on their own, or we might actually create wetlands that hadn't existed in order to absorb floodwater. Wetlands essentially act as a sponge. So as water is coming down your stream, if it hits an area with extensive wetlands on one or the other side, then those wetlands will absorb a bunch of that water and keep it from continuing to flood on downstream to whoever is next downstream. You're essentially altering that runoff coefficient. You're lowering the runoff coefficient. More of that water is getting absorbed into your wetland, and so it's not becoming part of a big flood that's going to affect someone. So wetlands play a really crucial role in limiting flooding, and a lot of areas have experienced big increases in flooding when wetlands were destroyed, when they were drained for development, for example. Now, the trade-offs to using wetlands are, well, that land is not available for development, and in some areas, the price of that land might be so high that people are just willing to pay a ton of money to get that land and to build houses or shopping centers or whatever else uh, on it. May be very politically opposed to any sort of laws that might require the preservation or maintenance of wetlands, etc. So you're giving up the ability to use that land for other things. And there's also just a cultural prejudice against swamps. So I like to use the term wetlands because it sounds more neutral. Swamp sounds really negative, right? We have like rhetoric about drain the swamp. That sounds like a good thing to do because we assume that swamps are bad and it'd be better to drain those swamps, even though keeping the swamps is actually good from a flood control perspective. So not a good metaphor to use politically. It reinforces that idea that swamps are inherently bad things when they're actually essential parts of our natural infrastructure. But that cultural prejudice against swamps, seeing wetlands as disease-ridden and smelly and gross and useless, inhibits our ability to maintain wetlands as flood control infrastructure, as well as preserving biodiversity, dealing with pollution, lots of other great things that wetlands do for us. Another thing we might do is to have flood insurance. So insurance is basically a method for spreading out risk. So with an insurance scheme, everybody pays in a little every year. You pay your annual insurance premiums, and then that money is used to give a big payout to anybody who is actually harmed at some point. So, we all pay a little every year, and if you get flooded, then you get the payout from that money that everybody was paying in. So it spreads the risk, shares the risk among people. And in the United States, flood insurance is a federal requirement. So the federal government requires that homes in the 100-year floodplain, so homes in areas that would be flooded if you had a 100-year flood. So remember back to how we calculate those. So the size of flood that has a 1% annual chance of happening. If you're in that area, then you are required to obtain flood insurance in order for your mortgage to be approved by the federal government. And so the picture there you see is from a GIS system that will allow you to identify those 100-year floodplains. And so you'll see there the light blue area is the 100-year floodplain along Wolf Creek. And so you may remember looking at that in topo map in an earlier lesson. We've got this creek and it's got this wide floodplain around it. And if you've ever driven down that way on Route 108, you'll know there are a bunch of houses down there very close to Wolf Creek. And so all those people, if they purchased their house or if they sold it to a new owner, they would need to have flood insurance because they're within that 100-year floodplain. If you're not there, then you're not required to buy flood insurance. So if you have a house, for example, within the borough of Slippery Rock, you can see it up there on the map, is not in the 100-year floodplain of any stream, and so you wouldn't be required to buy flood insurance there. Downside to flood insurance is it can encourage development in dangerous areas, because if you're like, oh, well, I got flood insurance, I don't need to worry about it, I'll get a payout if something happens. That can lead people to moving into dangerous areas because they feel like they can rely on flood insurance. And then the last point is that flood insurance is typically supplemented with federal, state, government aid. So if a disaster is declared, then the government will put in extra money to helping people who have been flooded, and also private charity aid. So a lot of charities will collect money and help people that have been flooded. So that's another mechanism by which we deal with the risk of floods, is we have these various ways that our society puts money together to help people rebuild and reconstitute their lives and replace what they've lost from a flood. And then another thing we can do about a flood is to evacuate. You can get out of there where there's a flood. And so in terms of evacuation, I'm talking about both temporary evacuation in response to a flood warning. So there's a flood coming, get out of there, stay out of there until the floodwaters go down, and then you go back home. You're evacuated for like a week or something. It depends on the length that the flood goes on, right? But it's a temporary thing, temporarily moving out of the way so that your life is safe, and you maybe take some of your most valuable possessions, documents, and stuff with you to keep them safe, and then you go back later. But we can also think about evacuation in terms of permanent relocation of people out of dangerous areas. So if an area has been repeatedly flooded, it's a dangerous place to be. We may look at moving people out of there permanently. And people may do that on their own. They may decide not worth it to keep living here because I keep getting flooded. Or there may be government programs that are organized to try to help people move out so that that area is no longer a liability. So we don't have to keep sending aid in, sending first responders to rescue people, paying out from flood insurance programs, et cetera. So we may try to organize to try to get a whole community to move out permanently from a dangerous area. Evacuation can be hard to get the message out. If there is a flood coming, how do you get through to everybody? Not everybody is watching TV. Not everybody's listening to the radio. Not everybody has a cell phone turned on to get an emergency message. Not everybody's looking at social media where various agencies might put out that information. So it can be hard to get the message out, and the most vulnerable people are often the hardest to reach, people who are in poverty. So they may not have an internet connection, for example, and so that channel is off limits to them. Or people who are, say, immigrant communities that don't speak fluent English, and so they may not get the message if it's in English, but they speak a different language. So the most vulnerable people are often the hardest people to reach with this message to evacuate in case of a flood. And then some people may not have the resources to evacuate. To get out of an area that is about to flood, you need access to transportation. You need the ability to find a place to stay, right? So money to pay for a hotel, for example. Some people may not have that, and so it may be very difficult for them to leave. People may have physical disabilities that make it hard for them to move, and they may not be able to just hop in any old car if they, for example, have a wheelchair that doesn't fit in every car or something. So not everybody is easily able to evacuate, and that becomes a problem in a flood situation. And then you have to balance the risks and costs of calling for an evacuation because floods are somewhat unpredictable. And so on the one hand, you don't want to fail to call for an evacuation when it turns out to be a bad flood, and then people get hurt by that flood. But on the other hand, you don't want to cry wolf and demand that everybody evacuate, and then it turns out not to be a big deal, and then everybody's life has been disrupted for no reason, and they're mad at you for that. So it's a tricky call on when to call for an evacuation, how much resources to put into evacuating people when we don't know for sure exactly how big the flood is going to end up being, and we're trying to deal with very fast moving information and rapidly changing situations. So for your lab activity this week, you're going to be looking at how we calculate return intervals and peak stages of floods, and you're also going to be looking at how we can use this information to evaluate the flood risk to homes. So if you were going to live somewhere, how should you think about planning for the potential flood risk to that location?